You're lying on your back in the darkness, staring at a ceiling you cannot see. Your wrists ache where the rope has rubbed the skin raw. Somewhere in the distance, a child is crying. Maybe yours, you can't be sure anymore. The smell of sweat and fear is so thick you can taste it. Tomorrow, they'll come again. Tomorrow, you'll be led into the sun with the others, examined like livestock, and sold to whoever offers the right price. But tonight, in this moment before sleep finally comes, you remember your name, the real one, the one they tried to burn out of you along with that mark on your shoulder. The Nile glitters in the morning light, indifferent to everything that happens along its banks. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from. It's incredible to me that a story this old, this buried, can reach people everywhere on the planet. Thank you for being here. This is the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt, sometime around 1450 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep II. The archaeological record is clear. This ruler documented his military victories with disturbing precision. One victory stele, carved in stone and meant to last forever, boasts of bringing back 89,600 human beings as living captives. Not soldiers, not warriors, people. The inscription separates them by category: men, women, children, because each served a different economic function in the machine that powered one of history's greatest civilizations. For centuries, we've romanticized ancient Egypt, the golden masks, the towering monuments, the mystique of the pharaohs. But underneath that grandeur lies a foundation built on systematic human exploitation that lasted not for decades, but for 3,000 years. The evidence isn't hidden in myth or enemy propaganda. It's written in Egypt's own administrative records, legal papyri, and temple inventories. They documented it all with the same meticulous care they brought to tracking grain harvests. And what they documented, when you read it in full, is difficult to comprehend. How does an entire civilization normalize something so brutal that it becomes routine? How do you build a culture where human beings are bought and sold with less ceremony than livestock, where women exist primarily as reproductive machinery, and where the system continues unquestioned for longer than most modern nations have existed? The journey began hundreds of miles away, in Nubia, in the Levant, in regions we now call Sudan, Syria, Palestine. Egyptian military campaigns swept through these territories with a dual purpose: political dominance and human acquisition. The army didn't just conquer, it harvested. Scribes accompanied every major military expedition, not to record battles, but to count captives. Young women were particular targets. Officials evaluated them during the march itself, making preliminary assessments of age, health, physical condition. Those who showed signs of illness or injury were often abandoned where they fell. The desert consumed them, and the columns kept moving. There was no economic value in transporting women who might not survive the journey. The ones who made it to Egypt arrived already transformed by trauma. Weeks of forced marching with minimal food and water, watching others die along the way, understanding with growing certainty that everything they had known was gone forever. At the border, the process became institutional. Processing centers, though that sterile term doesn't capture what they really were, operated near major cities. Women were unloaded like cargo, cleaned minimally, and prepared for the next phase. This is where the branding happened. Not symbolic tattoos, not decorative marks, literal branding with heated metal. The hieroglyphs burned into their flesh identified their owner, their origin, sometimes their intended purpose. The papyrus lancing, an administrative document from the Ramesside period, references these marks in the same tone you'd use to describe labeling storage jars. Pain was irrelevant. Permanent identification was the point. A woman could be resold, transferred, inherited. The mark ensured there would never be confusion about whose property she was. Egyptian law recognized the brand as legally binding proof of ownership, more definitive than any contract. What's striking in the legal texts is the precision. The Wilbur papyrus records transactions where women are sold for specific amounts, sometimes less than the value of a donkey. Their price fluctuated based on age and perceived reproductive potential. A woman in her teens or early 20s commanded the highest price because she represented decades of potential labor and, critically, the ability to produce more slaves. Children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's status automatically. Egyptian law was explicit on this point. The child of a slave was property from birth, regardless of who the father was. This created a self-perpetuating system. Buy one young woman, and you had potentially purchased 15 or 20 years of children, each of whom would work until they died or were sold. The mathematics of human breeding were calculated as carefully as any agricultural yield. The papyrus Harisyin, one of the longest surviving papyri from ancient Egypt, contains passages that scholars initially struggled to translate fully, not because the language was unclear, but because the content seemed too extreme. References to houses of female slaves, organized for the production of workers, appear repeatedly in administrative contexts. These weren't isolated facilities. They were institutions, carefully managed operations where enslaved women lived in concentrated groups under constant supervision. Their pregnancies were monitored by officials who tracked menstrual cycles, documented births, and recorded which children survived. Medical papyri reference examinations performed on these women to assess fertility, procedures conducted without consent, without privacy, designed purely to maximize reproductive output. Women who failed to conceive were often transferred to hard labor assignments because they had lost their primary economic value. Imagine the psychological reality of this. You're forced to bear children knowing you will not raise them. The moment they can walk steadily, around age 6 or 7, they're separated from you and assigned to children's work groups. Administrative texts refer to these separations as routine transfers, listing children by age cohort and destination. A mother might live in a textile workshop while her child was sent to agricultural labor 20 miles away. She would never know if they survived childhood, never watch them grow, never hear their voice again after that day they were led away by an overseer. The Egyptians understood family bonds, of course. Their own families were central to their identity. But they also understood that breaking those bonds in enslaved populations prevented solidarity, prevented planning, prevented hope. A woman isolated in her grief was easier to control than women who could organize around protecting their children. Sexual violence was so normalized it barely registers in the legal texts as violence at all. Egyptian law distinguished sharply between the rape of a free woman, a serious crime potentially punishable by death, and sexual assault of an enslaved woman, which was treated as property misuse at worst. If you raped someone else's slave, you might owe them compensation for the damage, but that compensation went to the owner, not the victim. Legal papyri record disputes where men argued over who was responsible for an enslaved woman's pregnancy, not out of concern for her well-being, but because the child represented economic value and its ownership needed to be established. Temple records reference women who served in religious contexts, and some of these references make clear that service included sexual availability. Women were attached to temples as property, their labor and their bodies considered resources for the priests. The harem system operated as institutionalized sexual slavery for women captured in military campaigns. These weren't marriage arrangements or honored positions. Tomb inscriptions and administrative records show that women in royal harems lived in designated quarters under guard, with no freedom of movement. They existed to be available when desired and invisible when not. Some spent their entire lives inside palace walls. Archaeological evidence from palace complexes shows quarters that functioned as luxurious prisons, beautifully decorated rooms that were nevertheless locked, guarded, escape-proof. Wall paintings that show graceful women serving pharaohs aren't depicting wives or priestesses in most cases. They're depicting captives whose alternative to this existence was likely death. Escape was theoretically possible but practically suicidal. Egyptian law granted owners the right to kill runaway slaves on sight, no trial required. Entire professional networks existed to capture escapees. Slave hunters who worked on commission, tracking people through the desert, bringing them back for reward. The Horemheb Decree, a legal reform document, specifically addresses punishments for slaves who fled their owners, prescribing escalating penalties. First capture meant whipping and additional branding. Second capture could result in amputation of feet to prevent future attempts. Third capture often meant execution as a public example. These weren't theoretical punishments. Skeletal remains from worker cemeteries show evidence of healed amputation wounds, individuals who survived the removal of limbs and were kept alive to continue working in whatever capacity they still could. The geographic scale made escape nearly impossible even if you evaded immediate capture. Egypt was bordered by deserts and sea. Running south meant crossing back through the territories you'd been captured from, now under Egyptian military control. Running east or west meant vast desert with no water. Running north toward the Mediterranean required traveling through the most densely populated regions of Egypt where any foreign woman traveling alone would be immediately suspicious. Even if you somehow made it to the coast, you had no resources to pay for passage, and ship captains who transported runaway slaves faced severe penalties. The system was designed to be inescapable, and it functioned exactly as intended. What's perhaps most disturbing is how thoroughly this brutality was woven into daily life. Children in wealthy Egyptian households grew up surrounded by enslaved women who cooked their food, cleaned their homes, cared for them when they were sick. They absorbed the idea that this was natural, that some people were simply born to serve others. Educational texts used in scribal schools included lessons on managing human property, calculating the economic value of slaves, and understanding legal frameworks around ownership. This wasn't hidden or shameful. It was ordinary administrative knowledge that any educated Egyptian needed. Temple priestesses owned slaves. Scribes owned slaves. Even mid-level officials owned enslaved women who managed their households. The system penetrated every economic class above the absolute poor. Religious ideology provided justification. Theological texts developed elaborate explanations for why foreign peoples were naturally inferior to Egyptians, why conquest and enslavement reflected the divine order established by the gods. These weren't fringe beliefs. They were mainstream religious doctrine taught in temples and reinforced through ritual. When pharaohs dedicated slaves to temples, it was framed as pious generosity, offering human resources to serve the gods. The fact that these offerings were traumatized women taken by force from their homes wasn't theologically problematic. The gods, according to Egyptian theology, had created different types of humans for different purposes. Enslavement wasn't a moral wrong. It was the natural order being properly maintained. Medical papyri reveal another layer of exploitation. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and Ebers Papyrus, famous for preserving ancient medical knowledge, contain passages describing experimental procedures. Some of these experiments were conducted on enslaved women, testing medications, attempting surgical techniques, observing the progression of untreated conditions. Enslaved bodies were used as learning opportunities without consent or concern for survival. Women died from these procedures, and their deaths were recorded as data points, information that helped physicians refine techniques that would later be used on free Egyptians. The concept of medical ethics, as we understand it, didn't exist, and even if it had, it wouldn't have applied to people who weren't legally human. The economic records are perhaps the most chilling documents because of their absolute mundanity. Temple inventories list enslaved women between entries for furniture and grain stores. 3 cedar chairs, 2 Syrian women, 14 bolts of linen. Estate inheritance documents transfer human beings alongside land and livestock. To my son, the northern fields, the herd of cattle, and the Nubian women who work the garden. Contract papyri record rental agreements where women were leased out for temporary labor. the term specifying that the renter could use them for any purpose during the rental period. These weren't euphemisms or hidden meanings. They were explicit legal arrangements treated with the same normalcy as renting a plow or a storage room. What happened to these women as they aged? Administrative records suggest that enslaved women who survived into their 30s or 40s, a minority given the working conditions and lack of medical care, were reassigned to the most dangerous or grueling labor. Quarry work, field labor in the hottest months, refused management in cities. They were worked until their bodies failed completely. Skeletal analysis from worker cemeteries shows bodies worn down by decades of malnutrition and repetitive trauma, spines compressed by years of carrying heavy loads, joints destroyed by constant labor. These weren't elderly people dying naturally in their 60s or 70s. These were 40-year-old bodies that had been used up and discarded. Many ended up in mass burial sites with no individual markers, no names, nothing to indicate they had ever existed as individuals. They existed, though history silenced them. Forbidden to write, these women left traces in archaeology, a hidden pendant beneath a floorboard, a foreign figurine defying Egyptian norms, wall scratches marking time. Small acts of resistance and remembrance that endured millennia beneath desert sands, proving identity can survive erasure. Egypt's vast slave system outlived empires, lasting 3,000 years, longer than the span between Jesus and today. 100 generations of women were born, lived and died as property, never knowing freedom. Their bondage was eternal, sanctified by gods, upheld by law, and accepted by all who might have ended it. The evidence exists in Egypt's own records because they saw no reason to hide it. They were proud of their organizational efficiency, their economic productivity, their ability to manage vast resources, including human resources across a massive kingdom for millennia. The scribes who documented these practices weren't troubled by them. The officials who calculated reproductive yields from breeding facilities weren't engaging in secret crimes. They were doing their jobs, managing state resources, contributing to the prosperity that built the pyramids and temples we still marvel at today. That's perhaps the most unsettling realization. This wasn't the work of monsters who knew they were committing atrocities. This was the work of ordinary people operating within a system they had been taught was normal, just divinely ordained. When you look at a photograph of the pyramids or the temple complex at Karnak, you're looking at monuments built on this foundation. Not built by enslaved labor directly in all cases. Recent archaeology suggests the pyramid builders themselves may have been paid workers, but built with wealth generated by an economy that treated human beings as commodable resources. The gold that covered the temples, the food that fed the priests, the taxes that funded construction, all of it flowed from an economic system powered substantially by enslaved labor, including the reproductive exploitation of captured women. The grandeur and the horror are inseparable. The woman, from the opening of this story, the one lying in darkness, remembering her name, is every woman this system destroyed. She might have been captured in Amenhotep II's Nubian campaigns. She might have been born in a breeding facility 50 years later. She might have been sold to a temple in Thebes or a household in Memphis. The details of her individual story are lost, but the outline of her life is preserved in thousands of administrative documents, legal texts, and archaeological remains. We know what happened to her with terrible precision, even if we don't know her name. She endured what the system demanded she endure. She bore children she couldn't keep. She worked until her body failed. She was buried without ceremony in a pit with dozens of others, and 3,000 years later, archaeologists found her bones and noted the markers of chronic malnutrition, repeated injury, and early death. She exists now as data, as evidence, as a reminder that the civilization we admire for its achievements built those achievements on the backs of people whose humanity was systematically denied for longer than our entire modern world has existed. And perhaps that's the thought we should sit with. Not just that this happened, but that it happened for so long, involved so many people, and was considered so normal that they documented it in the same records where they documented everything else they wanted to remember. They remembered the numbers. They preserved the contracts. They carved the victory inscriptions. They never forgot. They just didn't think there was anything to be ashamed of. That woman in the darkness, clinging to a name nobody would ever record, understood something her captors didn't. That being property doesn't make you less human. They wrote her story in ledgers and inventories, tracking her life like they tracked grain stores. But she knew who she was, even when everything around her insisted she was nothing. That knowledge, held in the dark, carried forward through generations who never stopped being human no matter how thoroughly the law insisted otherwise. That's what survived longest of all.